when was the first time you heard about Emerson? How old were you? Where were you? What were you doing? I can say I remember somewhere in an English, I think it was American Lit, in maybe the 9th grade. I came across, I think it was some assigned reading or something. It didn't mean much to me, reading Emerson when I was 12 years old. But there was something that resonated, because this was back in Texas, back in Houston, Texas. And what resonated was New England and the Transcendental movement, which Emerson, of course, was initiated, along with a handful of other intellectuals who were extremely influenced by the German Romantics, like Schelling and Hegel and Novalis. I think I really resonated with New England. And I was a boy in the South, you know, raised in I was a stranger in a strange land. And there was something about New England which really attracted me, where I think, oh, these people sound like they have something that I want. And so, you know, I came to New York and I hung out with lots of like-minded people who were also running away from hostile circumstances, like the suburban lifestyles. So we all sort of hung out in the East Village and did theater, and we did performance art, and we did music, and it was punk rock everywhere. But I was reading Emerson, and actually Gary Lockman, who was working with Blondie, CBGB's, a few blocks away from here. He was in a rock band, but he was also studying the occult, and he has since then become quite a leader in looking at the occult and the Gnostic and the hidden dynamics. So I find this is so in the 20s I started reading Emerson, but I found that my contemporaries really scoffed at him. They were all into the Frankfurt School, you know, very Marxist, very, you know, it was a time of tremendous upheaval. And then the AIDS epidemic hit, and then Reaganomics hit, and the little opening that there had been sort of vanished very quickly and went very deeply underground. But anyway, I think there's a resurgence happening right now. That's why I'm bringing up this history, because as I picked this up again after being away from it for a very long time, and it just like, wow, this is powerful. So I started with circles. I read the poet, I read the one on friendship, I read the tribute to Thoreau, who is a very close friend. I'm really, really glad that someone had this idea, because I was very resistant to it, reading Emerson. But I'm glad that someone put that forward, whether it was Doug or Eduardo or whoever it was. So I'm really curious about what your experience of Emerson has been, what your experience of Emerson might be, if there's any sentence or paragraph that really you're most attracted to in this particular essay. Maybe there are other essays also that you could draw from. I see the environmental movement, the gay movement, the civil rights movement, all of that comes out of Emerson. He was the one who started mapping this stuff. And I think he's a very Gnostic voice. And many, many voices I can detect in these essays. So it's very polyphonic, actually. All these individual voices entangled in one another. So anyway, that's my opening remarks, and I hope that stimulates something. And I'll press the pause button and look forward to all of your responses.
Well, I did notice too on your introduction that you had introduction to the website Infinite Conversations, Johnny, that you listed Emerson as one of your kind of models, someone who you highly respect and you have read.
I think what it was that attracted me was his sense of a collaboration. He was a sponsor for so many people. like Whitman, for instance. Whitman got a glowing review from Emerson, which really created his career. And you can hear that Emerson rejected politics because the two-party system he thought was so corrupt, there's no point in even participating in it. This was in 1820, he made this statement. So I think we still hear echoes of the dilemmas and paradoxes which he captures in his, I think, poetic prose. I mean, I think this particular poem, this particular essay is like a prose poem. So yeah, but I think it's his collaborative capacity that he was very much into sponsoring others and listening carefully and giving and receiving feedback, feed forward.
If I was to personally go into my introduction of Emerson, I noted that my American education was poor in its reference to Emerson. We did not read Emerson within my high school, within the university classes that I took. So I think on the side, I picked up the essential Ralph Waldo Emerson, a very thick volume, perhaps a Penguin volume, just essays. I tried reading those essays maybe in high school. And yeah, they're very far-reaching, radical, poetic prose that I perhaps connected to the more natural side of things. The more, maybe I was thinking more of Thoreau rather than Emerson. Maybe Emerson was the father of such movement, but Thoreau was what my generation picked up on, and like getting a cabin in nature, that type of mentality. But starting with the circle or circles, and kind of going off into all the different directions of his various essays, they're all saying essentially the same thing. They all have the same tone, this deep just desire to, I don't want to say pave your own path or go your own direction. Even that sounds kind of cliche, but he did such things. Most of these were either essays or lectures that he gave, and some of them, such as I can't remember the address he gave at Harvard, which essentially was criticizing religion. So he got kicked out of Harvard for 30 years. I guess he was a minister, and he decided not to be a minister after that and kind of seek his own path away from structured religion, away from the structures of society. So in a way, he was an anarchist, but not in the sense that many of us understand the word. I think there was a reference to David Graeber, who did Dead the First 5,000 Years. He does bullshit jobs. He considers himself an anarchist, but it's a way of living, so we have the circle of society, the religious modes, we have the capitalistic ideals, and in a way that's a dead shell to someone like Emerson. And you must pave your own way through all that by it's not simply deconstruction, it's not simply destruction of past beliefs, but it's taking that critical eye and projecting that into our true nature. He was very transcendental in the Eastern sense as well. He was influenced by the Bhagavad Gita, and that I suppose translations were first being introduced at that time, so that ties in with a lot of the underlying tone, particularly in this essay I picked up on. Maybe I'm wrong, but yeah, I found circles to be just very radical in a lot of senses. Uh, and, and as a framework, I know we propose to read the entire essay, touch on some themes. Others have proposed pick out your favorite, or what captions, what paragraphs, what sentences, what words really spoke to you. So I wouldn't mind with continuing some sort of introduction. I like Johnny's prompt of where were you on the day that Emerson was born in your life. So we'll continue on with you, Michael and Marco.
You want to go first? You want to go first, Marco?
I'm thinking back and like trying to trace my own personal like intellectual connection point, or where whatever lineages converge in me sort of touch on or resonate with Emerson, because I haven't read a lot of Emerson, and if you were to ask me to give an introduction to his life or work, or to the Transcendentalist movement, or to the historical or the literary or the philosophical context, I'd probably do a poor job, and I'd refer you to Wikipedia. But he's come up again and again, going back to the beginning of my reading career, I think, if I really think back upon it. And I think the connection for me, like one of the first books that meant a lot to me when in my formative years, Johnny mentioned, how old were you? 16, 13 when you read Emerson? So I had read Catcher in the Rye by Salinger. There's not a direct connection other than that they're both American authors, but Catcher in the Rye, I think, was kind of the gateway for a certain certain class group segment, however you divide it, of young men into an articulation of like the alienation and the differentiation from society, from social norms, that kind of like puts you on a path to finding and discovering the 19th century roots of that, like in American literature. Like Thoreau, Walden would be a canonical book to read, like coming of age, because this is the idea of returning to our primal vitality and to our primal freedom, and to constructing a world for ourselves outside of the strictures of society, or the matrix that we as growing adolescents are finding ourselves in and are trying to figure out. So to me, Emerson comes through Thoreau, who comes through Salinger, and then I'm less interested in Emerson than I am in Thoreau, just for a stylistic reason. And 19th century prose is it has a certain flavor and quality to it that I think could be difficult to appreciate at certain stages of one's life. I read this morning and was like, whoa, it blew me away. But my memory of reading Emerson was that he was a lot more boring. This was a lot more exciting than I remember him. And he came back into my circle through Nietzsche then, because Nietzsche cited him as a big influence. And now reading Emerson again, I'm seeing where Nietzsche gets a lot of his attitude. And Nietzsche kind of Germanizes it and gives it an edge. And he looks at, he's kind of post-Darwin. So he's bringing a kind of biological edge, or biologism, that is less present in Emerson. But the last connection point is with our recent Café on Marilynne Robinson, because she had recently done a talk, one of the West Coast universities, Berkeley or Stanford, but it was on the American Scholar, and it was a reflection on some essays by Emerson. And so I had listened to a podcast between her and Robert Harrison, where she discusses Emerson and the Transcendentalist tradition, and really more than just Emerson, but really the whole American intellectual and cultural tradition, which Emerson is one of the first real genius voices of. I think we forget this, like in our cultural climate now, that there is a solid tradition of American letters and intellectual life that is, of course, rooted in the European. It has the influence of the Eastern. It goes back to the Greeks and Romans, and there's the classical kind of the taking up of the classical tradition. But what Emerson and that generation of thinkers, I think, were doing were they were mapping a new culture. They were even trying to create a new culture. And I feel that spirit, that attitude, which Doug also invoked, this do it your way, like that has infused the whole American sensibility, the whole American identity and drive. And it's sort of become now a much more degraded form. Like, we don't get the purity that is, and the sort of spiritual dimension that is in Emerson. And that's really unfortunate, because I think if we were to go back and reread Emerson and rediscover, and I'm speaking now, all of us as Americans and like educated in the United States of America, having this cultural context, this circle around us, I think we would find that we have a foundation for, let me put this, we have kind of the tools. We have like some of the basic tools and the basic foundations we would need to actually address a lot of the problems that we're facing now, culturally and socially. Like, it's there in Emerson. There's already so much wisdom that is totally not on the table. But if we were to go back and kind of update it and bring it out of the innocence of the 19th century, like past all of the history that we've been through, the 20th century and what we're facing now, that innocence, there's an innocence there that I think is worth preserving. And that's part of what came through to me here, is that there's a grandness of vision, there's a grandness of the heart. Like, there's a sense of vast possibility and potentiality that I think we've lost a lot of as our attention has gotten narrowed down and mechanized. So that quality that I find in Emerson is what I'm interested in and what I feel drawn to.
Yeah, I was 12 or 14, like John, where I read a thin book by Thoreau, Man and Nature, which influenced me. Yeah, actually, I would say that it probably put me on the spiritual path. But then as I aged, I ran across Thoreau, Emerson, Whitman, through Alan Watts, different people I began to read as over the years. And even Ken Wilber has in one of his books, he has an interesting take on Emerson's influence in the Transcendentalists that I found appealing. But when I run across this notion of circles, what first came to my mind was from a mythological level of remembering reading Joseph Campbell, The Symbol Without Meaning, from his book in Gander, or Flights of the Gander or something. And for some reason, and that's probably because that resonates with me from a Zen perspective of how, I guess, and I think, the Transcendentalists were being very much, how would I say, aware of the use of language and ideas and how they were playing out in America at the time, politically and throughout. The one thread that just stays with me is, and has stayed with me, is always coming back and feeling grounded in nature. And that's one thing I appreciated about Emerson and Thoreau. And I also felt that they gave a better, broad understanding of the individual without going down the route that we've tended to go around about the rugged individualist and an individual that only thinks of themselves and can't learn how to use their individualness in collaborative ways, like John said. I think that that was kind of maybe, it just feels like somehow, like everything, as things go on, everybody puts their slant on it and then things get morphed. But when you go back and read them, you get a better, you kind of go back and go, wait a minute, that's, it's refreshing to go back and read. And so, and the circle being so important as far as from the mythological and Campbell way of how our roots and our evolution as tribes and as individual. Because I remember one thing I found interesting about Campbell's work with it, and I'm going off of my memory, but that intrigued me. The circle was where the tribe held things together, and it was the shaman always going outside the circle to bring back knowledge. And shaman, the shaman people, and it could be a male or woman, were willing to transgress that boundary that is formed with a group, which is natural and needed in an environment, So, but this rhythm of an individual going beyond the group, but coming back and hopefully passing on their experience and knowledge of what they gained outside the circle. So that's my connection to all this. Plus, I love Whitman because Whitman's use of language and especially his tenderness for being a heterosexual male. I was touched by how he gave me a male permission to have a male tenderness, even being heterosexual, which I think I grew up in an era where being a heterosexual man, a lot of times I got a message of, well, let's just say I said fuck it a long time ago to that image. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me right now? Okay, I'm experiencing delays on all of you. You just went like that real quick with the guesses there, but hopefully you can understand me. If not, speak over me, please. So nature centers into balls, and her proud ephemerals, fast to surface and outside, scan the profile of the sphere. Knew they what that signified. A new Genesis was here. So I have the annotated version in front of me right now, and it's stating that he added that short little poem a few years after when it was published in the 1847 edition. And I like his poetry. This poetry is dense. It doesn't necessarily summarize the entire essay, but it gives a glimpse into what he ties in a few paragraphs later with impermanence. We are the proud ephemerals that he's talking about, that are just kind of stuck on the outside of the earth, on the earth's surface. He doesn't go so far as to say we're floating in space. He keeps it grounded within what the eye can see, what we can see. And there's a fleetingness to our existence. It comes with a phrase such as proud ephemerals. And he ties us in with nature almost instantly here. So
Doug, was that poem like an epigram, or like was that at the front of the essay? Would one have read that if one had purchased the later edition before reading the beginning of the essay?
I would assume so. So when it was first published, you would have how it starts out. The I is the first circle, but so it would be a separate. Maybe I don't understand what you're saying because it cut off, but you said something about an epigraph.
Oh, so you're well. I think that he's this is a really interesting essay because, like John was saying earlier, there's a lot in it. There are many different voices in it, and there's also an argument of some kind. Like he's presenting a set of ideas, right? That some of which I think he's conscious of, and others of which are not. Like he starts with the I, and it's like this is like the primary principle or this ontological starting point, or the we could talk about it like in those terms. And I can't but think of a reading of Sloterdijk because he also has this starting point, like the center of the sphere or the center of these circles that ever expand outwards in Emerson's essay here is for him the I, right? So that's just a very interesting starting point that doesn't get reflected on too much. You posted about the transparent eyeball. This motif comes up again in that's Huxley, right? And the Doors of Perception, who brings the transparent eyeball back. And so when I think that, I can't not think of Gebser when I think of what organ we're orienting around, because the eye is the organ of the mental. It's the eye of spatialization, right? The eye is able to see perspective. It's able to establish distances. It's able to organize objects in space. And I know right away that I'm in mental space. Like I'm rooted, I'm grounded, I'm anchored in mental space as I'm reading this. And this is like a conversation that keeps coming up. Like what's mental that's not that's not, how can mental be not anti-intellect? How could, I'm going to flub saying this, but it's, it's my first orientation. Let's just say that. And then he moves from there to the second, like, so the ontogenesis goes from the eye to the horizon. That's the second circle that he describes. And then he says, this is everywhere. Like, and throughout nature, this primary figure is repeated without end. It is the highest emblem in the cipher of the world. He references St. Augustine, the idea of, and which I thought came from Pascal, but I guess it was Pascal got it from Augustine, the center with the circumference that's nowhere, the center everywhere. The circle,
isn't that Cusa? Nicholas de Cusa? We should look that up.
Yes.
When I mentioned it in the Bateson call the other day, because I think Nora Bateson referenced it at one point, there's no official route that I think anybody can identify, because it was referenced at various points. So it's a fitting quote for this essay then, which speaks of this, where does our intellect start and the previous generations start. We're building upon each other's efforts to create something great, yet at the same time we're saying the exact same thing, that here we are right in the middle, observing everything outside, and no matter where we stand, we're right there, and that's why the circumference is nowhere. So in a way, we are all just little mini gods running around. I think, Sloterdijk also referenced it at one point, and I think he was referencing Cusa. And so I took it as, at least in Sloterdijk, God, the whole thing is about God as a circle whose center is everywhere. So no matter where you look, no matter where you stand or sit, the center is right there, and the circumference is always changing, moving, there and not there. So what I took the transparent eye to mean is our relationship to God, that we all have this transparent eye. Emerson was a proponent of continuous revelation. I think he mentions it somewhere in this essay, when I touched upon the other essays, it kept coming up, but this continuous revelation is another theme of perhaps post-metaphysics, or whatever you want to say, that nothing is set in stone. And we, as individuals, as a species, as participants in this God experiment, are continuously revolving around new revelations. So there is no end or beginning.
If I may, I would just like to read the rest of the first paragraph, and so to let Emerson's language to sort of fill the space a little bit, kind of give ourselves a circle. After the line about God as a circle whose center was everywhere and its circumference nowhere, he goes on, "We are all our lifetime reading the copious sense of this first of forms. One moral we have already deduced in considering the circular or compensatory character of every human action." What does that sentence mean? I don't know. One moral we have already deduced in considering the circular or compensatory character of every human action. Another analogy we shall now trace, that every action admits of being outdone. Our life is an apprenticeship to the truth, that around every circle another can be drawn, that there is no end in nature, but every end is a beginning, that there is always another dawn risen on mid-noon, and under every deep, a lower deep opens.
It's just a quick note on the compensatory character. So that's a reference to his essay, Compensation. So it says, Emerson describes the perfect compensation of the universe, the absolute balance of give and take, the doctrine that everything has its price. Thanks, annotated edition.
So, I mean, here's where, just first paragraph, where I'm at is we start with the eye that sees, and then we are always transcending. It's like this ever outward movement. You called it endless revelation. And like there's a doctrine of the meaning of human life here, like the way that a human life should unfold, it seems. So I think that that's an interesting thing, because this is a particular orientation. It's not necessarily, how it really is. So I'm wondering about that tension, the metaphysics and the post-metaphysics and of this, and the mental aspect of it, and maybe other elements of it that are in the background or kind of latent.
Go ahead.
I'm glad you brought that up, Marco, because when I read The Transparent Eye, and this is influenced by a Tibetan book that I read, Eyes Wide Open, they have a practice of allowing yourself to sense the eyeball, the interior, and the way you described it and the way I read that of Emerson, of The Transparent Eye, I resonate with it, but at the same time I resist it because it didn't seem to speak to, well, what's the feeling in the eye in my body that's embedded in an environment that we're gazing out on. And this may be my limited my limitation is that's part of the I think that comes from that age of how science was coming from a very visual sense without giving a certain ratio acceptance of the other senses playing in how we're conceiving the world, if that makes sense.
I have to take that in. I'm remembering, I think it's Coleridge, who was the great romantic poet, who was influenced by that German tradition that Emerson was also influenced by. I think they even met each other. I may be wrong about that, but I remember in the Ode to Dejection, I can't quote the line exactly, but he says he's looking at a beautiful sunset and he describes how beautiful it is. And then he says, I see, but do not feel how beautiful you are. So I think Coleridge is already acknowledging that he has a phobic response. If you can see but not feel, that's dissociation of the unhealthiest kind. And I think this is right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. There were already, and I think Emerson is tracking this too, the beautiful landscapes are turning into, trains and, telegraphs, and we're soon to follow. And then, of course, we got planes, and we got, well, actually, the first modern war was probably the Civil War, where they had machine guns and mowed down thousands of men in 20 minutes. This was unheard of. It was also the biggest war in that century. It's hard. So I really so appreciate what you mentioned about his innocence. I think he's writing before the Civil War, but he was definitely really front and center in his attention was slavery. And he was one of those people who really risked a great deal by being an outspoken critic of that tradition. And I think that transcendental movement was the abolitionist movement, which was a very high-risk move in those days. You could end up in prison if you assisted a slave in escaping. So I think this is part of the dark side, the shadow, that I believe Emerson really focuses attention on. And I think he said the most embarrassing things. And I think that's where that Gnostic side of him comes. I just read, and I do love that first paragraph. I think there's so many resonances there. And I'm quoting from Harold Bloom's book, What the Daemon Knows. And I can't resist quoting him here, because he talks about the circles, this essay that we're reading. He's talking about that first paragraph. And he's talking about Waldo. He calls him Waldo. And his wife was named Lydian. So he says, in discussing circles with a friend of his, he says, I began to wonder if Lydian had spiced up Waldo's late morning meat pie with psychedelic mushrooms, first harvested in the Concord woods by Amerindian shamans. The opening paragraph wildly commences by tossing us into the midst of most speculative energies. And he goes on to say about this first paragraph, Emerson attributes a hermetic notion to St. Augustine. Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century had absorbed this from the Alexandrian Gnosis. An intense reader of English Neoplatonists, Henry Moore, Ralph Cudworth, John Norris, none of whom I know, the author of Circles found this heretical formula in Norris and exfoliated it gorgeously. Milton Satan enters with, under every deep, a lower deep opens. And Emerson cheerfully explores those deeps. So I love how he goes into the cracks and the crevices, and those interstices are the critic here. And he sort of finds where he's sort of doing a deep sort of dive into what's in between. So we can, and I really appreciate that he's taken all this time and energy to find these sources, which I would never have begun to find. But I also, so it's that innocence, probably that freshness that so many people find in him, but it's also, I think, something that I can only call queer. I just read this because it comes from another essay, but it's on friendship. And just a brief paragraph. And I think this also gives you, how it can pull you in to these uncharted territories, to these cracks in the cosmic egg, and risk saying things that are kind of embarrassing. But he pulls it off, I think, here. He says, he's talking about friendship. A friend, therefore, is a sort of paradox in nature. I who alone am, I who see nothing in nature, whose existence I can affirm with equal evidence to my own. Behold now the semblance of my being in all its height, variety, and curiosity, reiterated in a foreign form, so that a friend may well be reckoned the masterpiece of nature. The other element of friendship is tenderness. We are holden to men by every sort of tie, by blood, by pride, by fear, by hope, by lucre, by lust, by hate, by admiration, by every circumstance and badge and trifle, but we can scarce believe that so much character can subsist in another as to draw us by love. Can another be so blessed and we so pure that we can offer him tenderness? When a man becomes dear to me, I have touched the goal of fortune. I find very little written directly to the heart of this matter in books. And he goes on to say, I much prefer the company of plowboys and tin peddlers to the silken and perfumed amity, which only celebrates its day of encounter by a frivolous display. That sounds to me very, definitely a Gnostic voice. And he does say it's really hard to find this in books unless you have, unless you sort of take on that, go into that secret zone with an author. Because gay people have often became very adept at writing in code for other gay people because they had to go through a straight press to communicate to others, and they had to be very careful about what they disclosed. So I think just as the abolitionists were a secret society and the Underground Railroad, which was active at this time, and I think that also a lot of what we now look at, what I look at as gay people, as queer folk, they were tuning in to the shadow side and to the unexpressed erotica. I think Whitman, of course, is the great master here. But anyway, I'm just re-enchanted by this sort of dipping into Emerson again after being sort of alienated from him in my early 20s, and looking now at him in my mid-60s. It's quite a journey I've taken, and I realize he's been there all along, sort of like a hidden influence, and he's come through in a lot of my dreams and visions, which now I look back and say and sense how Emersonian they are. I'll just share one of them. I think I've shared this before because it was so pivotal. It was in my mid-20s when shit hit the fan. Everything was going the wrong way. And I remember seeing, and I had a dream, and it was a lucid dream, and I saw people being in chains, dragged through a street. And I screamed, "Do you want to live like slaves?" And I ran to this meadow, and there was a hill. And on the top of the hill, there was a beam of light. And I sensed that if I got to that hill, that beam of light, I would be exterminated and I would be beamed up, which is what I wanted, was like, get me out of here. So I ran through this meadow. I got to that little hill, that beam of light, and all of a sudden from every direction, there were arrows and they were spears, and they pierced my dream body. So I was like this big pincushion. And I said, but I'm not dead. I thought I would be dead and vaporized. And then I heard a voice. It was a male voice from up above my head. And it said, now go back and make a living arrangement. And I woke up. This strikes me now. This happened in my 20s and everything was going wrong. And I felt, okay, I think I got a message here. And it's also a very Emersonian message. And I think that's where he's lost his innocence in many of these essays. And he's been deconstructed through his beloved son died. He had lots of problems and was plagued by depression. But I think he went into those liminal zones and he attempted a reconstruction. And I believe I'm going through a similar transition now in my mid-60s that I went through in my mid-20s and in my mid-30s and in my mid-40s. It does seem to be that every decade has a where you're invaded by these demons, and and you have to wrestle them. And these threshold figures are coming at us right now, big time, as we, I think, are living in the world of subliminal messaging by these nefarious forces that are driving us crazy. So I believe we have, how do we find that? How do we ground ourselves? And as an update, you mentioned, how do we update this, Marco? I believe Emerson, that Emersonian voice, that being able to enter into the liminal zones and reconstruct something, I think that gives us enormous power, you know, that self-resilience. And I think we now more than ever do we need to ground ourselves, as we are, you know, in a great battlefield right now. So thank you.
I'm reminded of Terence McKenna, who said, "Culture is not your friend." And there's this badass line in the beginning of this essay, which is where I'm just going to read it because I think it reflects back on what John was sharing. There are no fixtures in nature. The universe is fluid and volatile. Permanence is but a word of degrees. Our globe seen by God is a transparent law, not a mass of facts. The law dissolves the fact and holds it fluid. Our culture is the predominance of an idea which draws after it this train of cities and institutions. Let us rise into another idea. They will disappear. And I think that that's like, he just like Bloom said, he drops you into a Gnostic place right from the very beginning, because we're beyond the world of what is apparent. We're beyond the world of what culture tells you is true, or religion tells you, or politics, or the media. We are seeing through to the essential reality, like the essential reality of things. And that's what I think this essay, the idea of circles and the idea that they're, you know, it's weird because he goes, it's also Gnostic in like, where did the circles come from? Because he goes into that in the next couple of pages. And he says, you admire this tower of granite, weathering the hurts of so many ages, yet a little waving hand built this huge wall, and that which builds is better than that which is built. The hand that built can topple it down much faster. Okay, here it is. Better than the hand, and nimbler, was the invisible thought, was the invisible thought which wrought through it. And thus ever, behind the coarse effect, is a fine cause, which being narrowly seen, is itself the effect of a finer cause. And then the next paragraph, he says, the key to every man is his thought. And I thought of Aurobindo and this idea of involution. Where is it that this world of this manifest world comes from? Everything that we've built, all of the ways that we've superimposed over nature, the highways, the trains, the factories, that all of which was just nascent in this time that Emerson is writing. He's seeing that is an effect of an inner reality, of a spiritual reality, and that if you change the spiritual reality, if you change the thought, then you would change the outer reality. You would change the manifestation. And I see, I mean, it's not fully fleshed out in this essay, but what I think that this transcendentalist movement and what, you know, people like Thoreau and Emerson were pointing to, they were already seeing, like Thoreau had said, you know, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. That's how he, you know, begins Walden. You know, they were seeing that let me put this, but that movement of mechanization was already taking over. And I think they wanted to inspire a different possibility. They wanted to keep alive this like flame of the infinite, and this flame of what is beyond the apparent forms, what is beyond the, you know, the given reality, the tradition. So it's interesting because I feel that they're creating a new tradition, but it requires this conscious act of disposing of the inherited tradition. And there's a double-edged sword there, I think, because there's also a trace of kind of the imperialist impulse, that sense of ever expanding, there's no end to what you can encompass in like the next larger circle, like that impulse, which what Sloterdijk called like the kind of invasion of the infinite, or the destruction of the circle, the destruction of the sphere. I think that what part of the innocence in Emerson is that there isn't the kind of facing of hard limits. And this is an early essay too. This is part of his early essays, I think it was 1947. So in his own life, he hadn't gone through some of the tragedies that you referred to, John. I remember reading about the death of his son, and there was more than one. He had multiple losses kind of, accumulate as he aged. And then historically, kind of what I was referring to was we went through the Civil War. We went through World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, the nuclear bomb, and we just can't really speak we don't have the luxury or something. We can't afford to be as capacious and as grand in that, I think, as Emerson was. But on the other hand, we need that to break out of the circles that we've entrapped ourselves and entangled ourselves in. We need access to that vision that he still had alive, which I think is really stultified, by those nefarious forces and the complications of our technological kind of entrapments that have emerged in the centuries since. So somebody expand on my circle. That was.
I'm reminded of I was reminded of our reading of the Parable series by Octavia Butler, and her vision to literally go to the stars, to form a society or a culture, or I don't know how it's termed in the book, just simply an intellectual mentality that breaks down any walls, that breaks down anything that has to do with society, that has to do with whatever. And what does she do in the book? Well, she breaks out of her communal wall, this dystopian society. It's literally demolished by the world around her, the insane activity going on. And as a teenage girl, she treks her own path towards her own Walden. She finds a man, Bencole, and he has a property up in, I think, Oregon, and they form this utopian society. That's what I was referring to as anarchic thinking. There was a reference to David Graeber's anarchic anthropology, which I think Johnny, I had referenced that it's out there. Johnny read it, of course, because he's talented like that, and I read it over the weekend. But it ties in with a lot of the work we're doing here, a lot of the work with the co-op, with this horizontal thinking. Not that we're against thinking into hierarchies or into the future or beyond, but it's the formation within. Graeber uses the term of the old shell. So we have all these old ideas. I mentioned religion, with society, capitalism, you name it, even family structure, how that's supposed to go. Work, you're supposed to go to work 9 to 5 every day. And all these structures are around us, and these need to collapse in Emerson's mind and Lauren Olamina's mind. And with these deep visions into the stars or into such a headspace that is able moment to moment to collapse any sort of idea that came before, yet still building upon these circles in a new fashion. It's hard. anarchy has trouble continuing on because the revolutionary idea often ends in chaos, perhaps, or there's no set plan beyond that. But what Emerson and all the characters in the Parable series are doing is I think Graeber mentions the revolution of the revolutionary idea. Like we are stuck in one mode of how a revolution is supposed to happen. So if we can even get beyond that and work together, that goes back to the communal effort, the collaborative effort of what we're achieving here, or what Emerson achieved with his essays and lectures. And so such visionary thinking is troublesome, it's radical, but it is a path forward that I'm willing to take. Another thing Graeber mentions is kind of the slow step towards that. It's not a total, like, okay, well, all this is surrounding me and it's not a total collapse of everything, but it's taking it one step at a time, eating away at those old structures and replacing it with new ideas, new thoughts, with new friends. So, yeah.
I can riff on that a little bit. I'm just looking at this, the text here. I think this is like the 4th paragraph. The new continents are built out of the ruins of an old planet. The new races fed out of the decomposition of the foregoing. New arts destroy the old. See the investment of capital in aqueducts made useless by hydraulics, fortifications by gunpowder, roads and canals by railways, sails by steam, steam by electricity. So he's saying how each innovation cancels out an industry, and those who were trained had those skills to make that particular technology work. You know, those skills are not needed anymore. And I'm thinking of the new arts, how new arts destroy old. You know, how photography changed portraiture, and how film changed theater. So, and now, of course, we're in the digital age. What happens to fiction? I think these are the kind of perplexities that we're all feeling as this, you know, this treadmill of innovation. We get very skilled in an area that gets, you know, becomes old real fast. And now we're at this, the innovation is happening so quickly that why learn anything? Because it's going to be obsolete tomorrow. So I think we're in this sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't dilemma. And I'm also thinking of something that a pianist that I loved when I was growing up, Horowitz, is a very famous performer. I saw him on stage, and believe me, it was the most being plugged into a cosmic current. You know? And I've seen some great performers, but there's nothing quite like this guy. I mean, he literally took a whole audience and fried their brains because this guy was so demonic at the piano. But I remember him saying, this great maestro, because he was raised, I think he was raised right when the phonograph was just started, you know, so part of him was before that technology, which we all take so for granted now, had taken off. And he said he didn't think it was a great blessing, actually. He thought it distorted music and performance a great deal. He says Brahms, it took Brahms, he did 4 symphonies. It took him 30 years to compose those 4 symphonies. He said any high school student can sit down and listen to all 4 of them in an afternoon. And he said that really isn't so healthy for music, because it makes innovation happen so fast that the performers can't keep up. So you look at contemporary music, and some of it is very beautiful, but I think this is why it's very hard now for orchestras to fill up an audience. Orchestras are going out of business all over the place, because it's not just that you can get good recordings and sit at home and listen to music. It's that that capacity to hold the attention of an audience, a large group of people. I think it's fairly shattered. And I know when I go to like the Carnegie Hall, and and there's so much noise going on around me, that I do really appreciate just staying home, because it's really, the audiences, the quality of the tension I've noticed has plummeted. So I think this is the challenge for all of us now, as we, the economy is changing so fast, and the robotics is taking off, and AI is taking off, and a lot of the things that people had to manually do, they don't need to do anymore. We're not going to need cashiers or bank tellers. So a lot of these industries, a lot of the skills that people have developed are not required anymore. And so I think we're really going to have to look at, in this gig economy, that's getting caught up in very destructive kinds of behaviors, and that the old kind of relationships between employer and employee, those kind of subjectivities, are vanishing quickly in this gig economy, and scrambling over scant resources is getting more and more stupid. Especially when we look at the devastation to the environment that has been unleashed by this constant so-called innovation. Our oceans are in peril. So I'm just thinking out loud about this, that if we can move towards a different kind of subjectivity collectively, that if we all had some sort of income that was guaranteed, as this has been posed by some innovators, I think, that a lot of people could be released from the master-slave dynamic, which we've all been brought up to believe in. And also, if you're not going to need all those bank tellers and all those cashiers, because everything's going to be automated, we're not going to need all these CEOs either. There's no purpose for them. At one time, maybe there was a purpose for having a priestly class or an elite who were able to read the future and sort of come up with policies that supported the collective. But that kind of elite, I think, is getting more and more unnecessary. And I think this is the challenge, I think, and I think a lot of what you mentioned, Doug, about our coming together and sharing our resources intellectually and spiritually in this medium, which most of us, a lot of us don't quite understand. How are we going to bring this is all simulated. We're trying to create a cafe atmosphere here. But we know it's not really a real cafe. That's a metaphor. And I think it's a good one. But I think it's really challenging. That I think it's going to have to be like it was with the abolitionist movement. A lot of weirdos getting together with these really weird ideas like, we need to get rid of slavery. That was considered an incredibly crazy idea. That was a 500-year international institution. And of course, the Civil War brought on its collapse within four bloody years of war. The slavery was over in the South. So I'm just sharing this with you out loud because I don't have a solution at all, but I do have a sense that there's a transition that we're making, and we're making it together. And we can, I think, take some motifs from the old world as we make this transition so that we can make the transition. You can't just jump into a new cosmology because you think it might be fun. No one does that. And embracing the liminal zones. Chaos is not something you want. I wouldn't, I've been in chaos. You do not want chaos because there's nothing at all to hold on to. And there's no guarantee you're going to get through it. But I think it looks like now we don't have much choice. We're moving so quickly into a chaotic phase. But I think we need voices like Whitman and like Thoreau and like Emerson to help us ground and trust that we're going to get through this.
I'll do a little more reading here. I've lost track of where I am in here, but it's the end of a paragraph. It says, people wish to be settled only as far as they are unsettled. Is there any hope for them? Then the next paragraph says, life is a series of surprises. We do not guess today the mood, the pleasure, the power of tomorrow when we are building upon our being, or up our being. And carrying on, there was somewhere in here I wanted to read. So he's going into the divine, but the masterpieces of God, the total growths and universal movements of the soul, he hideth. They are incalculable. I can know the truth is divine. I can know that truth is divine and helpful, but how it shall help me, I can have no guess. For so to be is the sole inlet of so to know. The new position of the advancing man has all the powers of the old, yet has them all new. It carries in the bosom all the energies of the past, yet is itself an exaltation of the morning. I cast away in this new moment all my once hoarded knowledge, as vacant and vain. Now, for the first time, seem I to know anything rightly. The simplest words, we do not know what they mean except when we love and aspire. I didn't have a follow-up for that. Go ahead, Marco.
Well, I want to give space for Michael because we haven't heard from him in a while, and
I want to hear from your Michael. I want to hear from your somatic intelligence before this call is over.
I appreciate that, both of you. I just been really, doing my practice of really listening to all of you and the points of view, because I recognize that I have an edge of not understanding or the breadth of reading that you guys have, and we all have different ones, but I'm just owning my edge. And so Johnny, in terms of what's happening in the transition we're going through, I totally 100% agree that that's online. I come from the place, chaos or not, how am I responding? How do I teach myself? And that's why I like walking the labyrinth. I bow before I make a threshold, like I'm entering a liminal space. Walk the labyrinth, and when I get to the circle, I also bow. And I need to step back. When I bow to enter, but I first bow outwards to the world I'm leaving, and bowing to the world that I enter. And then walk the labyrinth, and that. This has given me a somatic intelligence of when I sense with my skin that I'm entering a liminal zone, a liminal space. It's given me a good practice to have antenna. Okay, how much chaos am I entering into? Do I want to enter into it? Do I have the capacity to go into it? And it's a very boom, boom, boom decision sometimes. Other times it's slow, because sometimes I want to be careful of how I may have a conditioned response to chaos that's a conditioned response that maybe it's not the kind of chaos I have to worry about, but it's chaos, if that makes sense, because it has this disruptive tone to it. But not all disruptive tones should I have a a default response to. So it's kind of a learned response, and it's very shamanic, based on, like I talked about with Campbell, that the shaman is willing to go into this darkness, the over the edge, to transgress and come back. And it is a transgression. I think people need to understand that. That's felt in your body, a transgression, in the sense that it's a tension, it's a sensation, it can be intense. And a lot of times the way I work with it is turning a feeling, is this the intensity I can work with? Because a lot of this learned response is learned from, and this is just a rough theory of mine, from the age of even being in the womb and up to 7 years old, when my understanding, the mental comes on, the rational. And in between that time, your nervous system has been affected by intensities of interacting with your caretakers in the world around you. And that pre-verbal, my engagement with the Tibetans and Raji Ray is, there's a way to just to practice opening to the pre-verbal, breathing and feeling the intensity, and not needing to use the mental to fix it, but maybe gently let it, let the intensity and the pre-verbal kind of reach for the words gently, reach for the description gently, and not let the mental try to go, oh, I need to fix it. I can't feel it. Like you're saying, I love when you said, see but not feel. God, that is just where I'm at right now. And that's a lot of my work when I have posted, is I want people feel they're seeing, not just see. Feel, bring that the ratio, work with the ratio of your senses. That's how I view this dialogue that I've heard. That's where I'm at. So thank you for listening.
There are a lot of themes in play here. I'm feeling like in a conversational, low-grade conversational chaos, and there's many potentials that we could pick up on. This feeling and seeing, to me, it's significant because it gets back to that difference between the mental and the integral. And I've been in kind of multiple interlacing contexts involved in a discussion about what those terms mean and what we're talking about when we talk about the integral or the mental or the post-mental or post-metaphysical. There's a lot of terminology that's involved, and part of the problem that I have with a lot of it is that and I have to be totally clear that it's not anti-intellectual and it's not anti-mental, because that's always sort of the assumption, is if you critique a mentalist, a mental-oriented way of dealing with things, that you're anti-mental.
Yeah.
And I think on the other side, it's the same, like that there are anti-intellectual strains in our culture, and those are really annoying, because I appreciate thought. I appreciate the life of the mind. I'm passionate about it. It's not. I would never want to get rid of that. I would never want to get rid of it. And the eyeball is an important organ, but it's one organ. It's not the whole. And and one eyeball is not even two eyeballs. There's one eyeball at the center of. We need two at least to get stereoscopic depth perception. And we don't just have eyeballs. We don't just see. We also feel, we hear, we sense, we touch, we taste. Like we are, to me, that is more integral. And so when we are communicating, when we're making cultural making culture or making cultural interventions, they should, to me, they should have all of those qualities in some kind of ratio or balance. It's not static. It's always changing. Some contexts more mental, some contexts more physical, some contexts more audio. But to me, aperspectival or the integral means flowing between all of those modes, not really being stuck in one or the other.
Yeah.
So this essay is really interesting with the circles and the eyeball, because we've gone through a conversation like this before. And Michael, you weren't in that conversation. It was Peter Sloterdijk and his trilogy Spheres. They're very the core ideas are very related, but there's an important difference, and that is that in Sloterdijk, in his conception of what's at the center, it's not a transparent eyeball. To him, the emergence of complexity and of all of the whole world of social relations, of human existence, it comes out of it comes from the relationship of the child to the mother in the womb. That's the kind of origin point. And in his book, Bubbles, he goes into a kind of, I'm going to use phenomenology of what that is like, and what are those primary experiences that shape and pattern the ones that follow.
Yeah.
Because there's not a monad at the beginning. There's a relationship.
I like that.
There's an enclosedness. There's a kind of audio environment. There is a voice. There are vibrations. And then as we are born, and then as our relationships take on more definition, then we begin to make the various distinctions of myself, other, mother, father, friend, enemy, safe, dangerous, and so all of those come. But the individual ego, the monad, that comes later.
Yeah.
And it's one element amongst a whole ensemble of elements that are unfolding to make a world. And so if we're resonating with a world and we're speaking to and into a world, and even a potential world, then we want to animate, I think, those various registers and dimensionalities of experience. And that, to me, includes the mental, but is very much not limited to it.
Yeah.
And so I think that, to me, to update this would be to preserve that sense of that Gnostic sensibility, that sense that this is all coming from a divine source. It's coming from a deep and deeper than deep source. But so to preserve that, but then to ground it, or to embody it in the relational and in the multiplicity, like of our experience. Well,
and I just want to touch in because I agree with that monad of the ego, how that can be a disruptive, it has, because of the way of the structure of the ego, at least developmentally, part of its job is, it comes through my understanding, comes through the defense system from my experience, it's what's happened is now I can come back into my ego and understand that it's not necessarily in control, but it serves a function. It's function, and it's not. I'm not as identified as a narrow view of who I am. It's a function, like Suzuki Roshi said. You need just enough ego to cross the street, and then you're across the street. And so, I feel it's like integral has helped me understand to integrate the ego as a structure in a new way. And I'm constantly, since I'm doing that, I'm constantly also acknowledging that distinction that the ego represents still has things in the structure, but because of my practice, I have a better, I'm not reacting off of them. They just are there, and I have better training of how to go, oh, okay, so this is, I can be present with it without the reactivity. if that makes sense. And it is, I just want to emphasize very, 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 it's an ongoing practice, but because the way I'm trying to language it, I'm at a place of trusting my practice rather than working my practice, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. I'm coming to an edge here. This conversation, I think there's many resonances and vibrations and overlaps and liminal zones we're adventuring together in. Michael, you talked about the ratio of the senses, and from being born to the age of 7, all the intensities that we go through. And I'm thinking of, I think you mentioned, Marco, the inner and the outer, and those explorations that we've done with clean language and quantum poetics, and how we have a kind of, I think we have evolved a kind of group style, or a stylistics, a kind of aesthetic overlay, as Ariadne and Michael and Marco and Doug. I think Ariadne riffed on a session that we all had together and created a lovely poem, and Marco sort of riffed on that, and I sort of riffed on Marco, and we're all riffing on each other at this point. And I think that is, those are signs of, these are certain signs to know, faithful friend from flattering foe. Can this guy or gal riff with me? You know, can he or she receive my riffs and go in a direction that surprises everybody? You know, I think these are the kind of thought experiments and that kind of experimentation that we've cultivated is deeply Emersonian. I can't find the quote. Oh, yes, it is. I did find it. I just looked right at it. He says, "Lest I should mislead any when I have my own head and obey my whims, let me remind the reader that I am only an experimenter. Do not set the least value on what I do or the least discredit on what I do not, as I pretended to settle anything as true or false. I unsettle all things. No facts are to me sacred. None are profane. I simply experiment, an endless seeker with no past at my back." So I find that is quite a sort of, I think our group kind of resonates with this American master, no doubt about it. He was a master and a servant, I think, Ralph Waldo Emerson. But I mean master in the sense of a maestro, of someone who's really created the essay. And he's one of the great essayists, I think, that has ever been produced. And he turned it into, you know, a real art form. And I think you could compare him with Montaigne. Many have. Harold Bloom has. I think you can compare James Baldwin to Emerson. I think James Baldwin was probably in, what was, I can't remember that essay, but it's I think it's probably one of the greatest essays in the English language was written by James Baldwin. And I can't remember the title of it, I'm blocking on it, but I think that you know, I don't want to worship the past. I certainly don't think Emerson did, but he knew Plato, he knew Shakespeare pretty well, and he knew his Bible, that's for sure. But I think he found in those, when he went to those liminal zones, he found those, I think he took some of those motifs with him, and I think that's what we're trying to do too. I think we're relying though on, as I think he did, with something that I don't think this technology has distorted and disrupted, that somatic intelligence. And when you're in the same room with someone, you can look into their eyes, you're in the same environment, you know the quality of the light, you know what the ceiling is, you know where the floor is. No one needs to tell you that, you already know it, because you're sharing an environment with someone, and there's there's a cloud out there, or there's a rainy day, or there's a sun that's shining. I mean, these are all the things that are in the background, but have an affective influence on our relationship. And that, I think, is what we're losing with this technology, unless we use the technology in a different way than has been brought forward by the competing subliminal messages, trying to get buy something or to vote for somebody who doesn't have our interests at heart. So I think we're in this kind of a very volatile situation, which we've always been in. You know, humanity has always been in a volatile situation. But I think it's just the temperature is warming up really fast. And so I think that my theme here recently is, I think it's been, it's somatic intelligence, sense making, and meaning making. And how meaning making, we can't make much meaning unless we make sense already.
Yeah, the two are connected. The two are connected.
Yeah, and I think that is where a lot of our culture is getting stuck in ways that, you know, I don't think, we've always had these problems, but I think that people were much more grounded in the age of Emerson than they are now. So anyway, that's what I'm looking at. And I'm also thinking about something that Marcus said when I was, when you visited in New York. We were in a cafe with my friend Seth, and we were talking, and you described an episode of In Your Youth, and you were talking about a good friend of yours, and you were like hanging out with a boombox or something, listening to music. And talking about, I don't know what you were talking about, but you talked about ecstasy and how there was something about an ecstatic quality of friendship, and how most teenagers, when they find a peer group, experience that. That's what they get plugged into, is that ecstasy that friendships and our peers can give to us. And I think how often and how sad it is that we lose that as adults, especially men, because we start to compete with one another, and we lose that tenderness and the ecstasy of friendship. Not that women certainly can't suffer from that kind of alienation as well, but I think it gets amplified even more in the kind of masculine psychology that we're all so familiar with. So that's why I think the feminine is so important for us right now. We need to tap into that feminine intelligence, which every guy has. You know, it just hasn't been cultivated. I think we need to do that for ourselves.
I happened to listen to a podcast with Chris Durkis, with a female talking about masculinity, and I love his approach to masculinity. But John, one of the things he said as terms for a heterosexual male to kind of draw for their reboot or redoing their masculinity is actually a gay man from the 80s. You know, I thought that was really interesting that he brought that forward, because it was about their willingness to express themselves, to be individual and care about others. And that doesn't mean, and this is one thing I feel fortunate at the coffee shop. Darren is a gay man I've been interacting with, and I went through a period of understanding how to work with that culture as a heterosexual and dealing with my overlay of what I was taught, and how to well, taking a lesson from what my female friends had told me of how to tell a gay man, I don't go to your church. I'm sorry, but I'm not gonna get redneck and smash your face in because you made a advance on me. You know, it's been it's helped me grow a broader sense of masculinity that, like Chris talks about, whether it's female or male, the individual gets to choose what their masculinity or gender is about.
That's right.
And you may draw on certain archetypes or prototypes and stuff, but it's not to get locked into how the message of society of telling you, if you're a man, in terms of masculinity, that you're a pussy because you're gay or whatever. No, fuck you, you know. Come over here. You say that to me and I'll smack you. You know?
I remember seeing a drag queen being taunted by some boys. They were on the other side of the street. She was walking down the street. She was a real tall, black drag queen. And I remember her saying, as they were taunting her, she says, "Oh yeah, if I'm a man, why don't you come over here and fight me?" None of the boys crossed the street.
Yeah.
But the girlfriend I was with, one of my female friends I was with, she says, no woman would ever say that.
Yeah, right.
And I thought that kind of masquerade, how we, and I think this is how we put on masks and take them off. I think gay men, especially in the 80s, the 90s, were extremely good at this. Mm-hmm. They were able to, it was called gender fuck, mm-hmm. And you could be hyper masculine. And I think most, if you see a really masculine, hyper masculine guy with lots of muscles, chances are he is gay. That's a very much a heightened hyper masculinity. But I lived with a drag queen. I lived with a black drag queen. He was a dancer. He was very beautiful, classically trained ballet dancer. He ended up being a world-class dancer. But when we were living together, he performed in drag every night in the cabaret. And when he got into drag, he looked just like Diana Ross.
Wow. And
he would, go to work. And I remember one of the little babushka ladies in my she asked me, she says, "How many people are living in your apartment anyway?" Little did she know. But I'm just saying, but I also wanted to make I had a friend I knew at a workplace, and he was straight, and we went out one night, and I think we were having beer or something, a real neutral place, and he said, "Well, you know what? You can admit it. It's okay. You're really attracted to me, aren't you?" And I went, no, I'm not, Mike. And he said, "Well, it's all right. I'm not going to be offended. Actually, I'd be flattered." No, I'm really not attracted to you at all. But I had these kinds of, so I appreciate if someone comes on to you, whatever gender or whatever orientation, it may not be wanted. But I found myself shutting down around straight guys because I was afraid they're going to think I'm attracted to them.
Yes, right.
And that was sort of a truism back in the 80s. I don't think it, and there was a lot of genuine bisexual experimentation going on. Mm-hmm. But it got very polarized during the AIDS epidemic. But I'm just sharing that with you because I think the 80s, the 70s and the 80s, the 70s especially, were a golden age in many ways in terms of exploration, experimentation, going beyond the edge. And taking masks on and taking them off. It was a very theatrical period. Unfortunately, the AIDS epidemic, along with Reaganomics and Thatcherism, sort of wiped out all of the gains that were made. But I think maybe now, several generations later, we can draw upon those resources. And as we get older, we can reflect upon some of our behaviors. And I think that a lot of that was tremendously tragic, and some of it was glorious, outrageous, ecstatic beyond belief, and very shamanic.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I was attracted to this circles, because I am a practitioner of the labyrinth besides sitting meditation, and it's a circle. But it's interesting. It's a circle that has lines that goes back and forth, and it kind of you take the content of yourself into the circle, and that whole kind of liminal zone of creating circles of that I move through different circles of friends, and I feel it as a union of mental efficient, like you guys, healthy mental or rational, healthy rational, and healthy feeling. They're not separate in my book. When they become separate, I know I have to go walk the labyrinth and basically take my stuff to the center and bring whatever else out. Like I say, I bow when I go out, or when I before I bow outward, I bow inward. When I go to the inner circle, I bow outward, I bow inward. That bowing is an intentional to bring my attention, in your terms, John, of a quality of attention. I am entering a liminal zone, because I think part of the fucking mess is people don't pay attention to the liminal zone. And it's a gift to pay attention to the liminal zones in our lives. It's a gift, but it's a pain in the ass gift too sometimes.
I think the great danger is we try to numb it, or we do the Prozac, or we do some psychoactive, or the Valium or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that short circuits our capacity to handle our own evolution.
I use food. I use food to numb it. I'll eat sometimes.
Yeah, because it's really hard to stay with it.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
So we do our best to distract ourselves from it.
Yeah.
And also, I hate to say this, and I think Emerson was aware of this, sometimes your friends can be the biggest distraction.
Yeah.
They don't want you to be, they want you to be happy, not sad. You know?
Right,
and they'll do everything to help you avoid dealing with these impasses and dilemmas and paradoxes, unless you can let them go. And just,
and it's usually because they haven't dealt with it within themselves the way Emerson wants to deal with it. Fortunately, I have a few friends that I've nurtured of this quality that we can hold the space for each other during. But there's other friends I'm highly aware, that that's just not going to be the case with them. I have to accept that. That's just reality.
This is Emerson. A man's growth is seen in the successive choirs of his friends. For every friend whom he loses for every friend whom he loses for truth, he gains a better. So, that's a great line. Just there's a number of choice lines just like that.
Line. That's a great
line. A man's growth is seen in the successive choirs of his friends. But then, that's on the positive side. But then what you were just speaking to, Michael, he goes on to address that actually. He says, I thought as I walked in the woods and mused on my friends, why should I play with them this game of idolatry?
Yes.
I know and see too well, when not voluntarily blind, the speedy limits of persons called high and worthy. Rich, noble, and great they are by the liberality of our speech, but truth is sad. Oh, blessed spirit.
Oh, God. Thank you, Emerson.
Oh, blessed spirit, whom I forsake for these, they are not thou. Every personal consideration that we allow costs us heavenly state. We sell the thrones of angels for a short and turbulent pleasure. And then to the limitations. How often must we learn this lesson? Men cease to interest us when we find their limitations. The only sin is limitation. As soon as you once come up with a man's limitations, it is all over with him. He has talents, he has enterprise, he has knowledge. It boots not. That's great. It boots not. That's like that could be rebooted. Actually, that phrase.
How would you say it? How would you say it, Marco?
I don't know. Something that doesn't make sense. It doesn't boot. It doesn't boot. It boots not. What the fuck are you talking about? It boots not.
I kind of like it. It boots not. It's like forsooth and I prithee, and I think it's those. I think there's something really scary when we try to update Shakespeare, and take out the thee and the thous and all that stuff, and make it hip and cool. So I sort of like, and it's hard to get into the rhythm of Thoreau because of the diction is so highfalutin for us and so formal. But as you get into it, you start to realize there's a formal sort of surface, but there's a very informal, something underneath that's very fluid and dynamic. And I think that's what that surface, the surface is so elegant, but what's being said is actually pretty anarchistic underneath that sort of surface elegance.
Speaking of anarchistic, I think that we should not depart from this call without quoting Emerson on economics.
Oh, cool.
Let me find it here because it was really great. Here it is. I hope this is it. I've gotten my papers all mixed up. Maybe one of you can help me out. He's talking about debt. And he's talking about the ways that different people value different things. And the money lender values you paying back your debt. But what if there are other debts that are more important than the economic debt? And he's making an argument here that I thought would be extremely relevant, like in the age of Occupy Wall Street and economic collapse. Here it is. One man's justice is another's injustice. One man's beauty, another's ugliness. One man's wisdom, another's folly. As one beholds the same objects from a higher point, one man thinks justice consists in paying debts and has no measure in his abhorrence of another who is very remiss in this duty and makes the creditor wait tediously. But that second man has his own way of looking at things, asks himself, which debt must I pay first? The debt to the rich or the debt to the poor? The debt of money or the debt of thought to mankind, of genius to nature? For you, O broker, there is no other principle. And that's where I think I lost my my pages. They all got mixed up in the kind of chaos of this.
I can continue on if you'd like.
Oh, please. Yeah.
For you, O broker, there is no other principle but arithmetic. For me, commerce is of trivial import. Love, faith, truth, of character, the aspiration of man, these are sacred. Nor can I detach one duty, like you, from all other duties and concentrate my forces mechanically on the payment of monies. Let me live onward. You shall find that, though slower, the progress of my character will liquidate all these debts without injustice to higher claims. If a man should dedicate himself to the payment of notes, would not this be injustice? Does he owe no debt but money? And are all claims on him to be postponed to the landlord or the bankers? Then the next paragraph continues with, there is no virtue which is final, all are initial.
That's really great. I mean, because I think that's part of the spirit that I think we need in this age. Like everyone, and I'm included, is so preoccupied, with money, with economics, with business, with innovation, with the next technology, with the next and the content of our character is lost in the miasma of those preoccupations. And when I think of the innocence of Emerson, it's more that there was still a sense of nobility, still a sense of the ultimate importance of cultivating the soul, like cultivating the quality of truthfulness, the quality of aspiration, the quality of divine inspiration. Like this is in Emerson in copious amounts. It's like brimming over and overflowing through him. And then, in the historical process, nihilism comes on board, and there's this like corrosion from within. And so part of what I think could be, part of what I think could be valuable in visiting this material and in kind of dipping our pails into the well, of what Emerson has, is that there's this there's that sense of nobility, that sense that we could be a lot better than we are. We could rise above or intensify more deeply, through the the chaos of forces that are kind of holding us in some sense back. And I think that the slavery bit is still really important. We don't maybe have institutionalized slavery in the gross sense of one human being dominating another. That still exists. It's more marginal, but I think we have a different kind of slavery, and it's called wage slavery. Like we live in a world or an economic system or a society where that effectively is what binds people and what controls their behavior. And there are masters and slaves in those dynamics. And I think that I'd like to think of what would a society look like that didn't have wage slavery. What would that look like? Can we go I want to go in that direction. Like I want to expand the circle, to break the circle. A circle could be a set of shackles, that binds us into a particular world or way of being. And if we break those shackles, we can open into a much wider sense of what's possible.
Well, Marco, and kind of just riffing off of what you just said, I think Emerson is an example of the nobility of not enslaving oneself.
Mm.
And when you're not enslaved yourself by your own experience or thoughts or anything, you want to be noble enough to share that with others. I see the progression that way of how honoring and working with how you could be, you can enslave your own soul. And the more you work with your own soul, the nobility, like you said, of working with your own soul, it just naturally, for me, it can naturally, I'm going to spread this to others and deal with the actual feet on the ground material world of how wage slavery and all that.
Yeah, we have to be strategic, I think. You can't just quit. And some people, romantically, you quit your job and walk out of the cubicle and go off and start some new life.
I've had to work with yes, I agree. I've had to go through that myself of as much as I embrace a certain romanticism, reality, feet on the ground. I maintain my health care. I try to give, practically, but I think what I'm trying to say is the noble idea is also not being enslaved by the arithmetic of money and economics, if I can say it that way.
Yeah. You had a whole talk about this, the last Café.
Mm.
And I'm with you. That's an important.
I don't want to overrule it.
That's a really good distinction, because the first there's no real slavery. Slavery is an agreement on some level.
Yes.
But the penalties for breaking that agreement, if you're in the wrong position, would be, severe. So, but in oneself, one could be not a slave.
Yes.
Of any kind, in one's consciousness. Yeah. That's the difference. And I think then from that position, one can then plot the actual escape.
Yeah, and I don't want to be romantic that there's not a practical, even in the internal, there's a practical, you practice that, not enslaving oneself. You practice, you bring attention to how you might be doing that. And that's not romantic. That's fucking messy.
Yeah. That's right.
There's a post a while back that you did, Marco, about how to contribute to the site in reference to the gift economy. And essentially, I think this is tying in with that concept. And I don't know much about it, but another one of your lists here, you had a list of your Emersonian themes, but some of the items on the list that you posted for how to contribute to the site was just simply cultivating a curious attitude, being yourself, trying something new, saying what you really think when you've actually really thought about it, along with all sorts of other various modes of contributions. And not a single one mentions money or contributing financially. And that's what Emerson is getting at. That's what we're all talking about here. That when we were talking about friends, I'll just briefly state that I never had that core group of ecstatic friends or radical friends I could branch off with. I was always limiting myself, whether social anxiety, but even in that atmosphere of a shared reality. There was always some sort of either intellectual limit, or they were all Christians. At that time, I limited myself and think, oh, they're Christians, and I can't reach out with my version of spirituality with them. But we persevere, we carry on, we meet as much as humanly possible once a year for a camping trip, or sometimes at one another's houses. And we have changed. Our circles are constantly expanding with family, job, location within the States or in other countries. But we make that time to meet again. And each year I find myself making more of a point to express that true self. This doesn't tie in with money right now, but it ties in with that gift economy mentality of just speaking what needs to be said, of sharing what needs to be heard, of deepening into that relationship. So, of course, 20 years ago when I first had this group, I wanted to demolish any limits. I wanted to be able to just reach to the core and create that new friend society that I imagine. But it is a one step at a time type of thing. That's all I want to say right now. I don't know. I'd like to tie that in with what the two of you are talking about. Somebody else can do that better than I.
A little thing that I work with, and I don't know how this might fit in, but because of my fixed income and how I've worked through my recovery, I started making the distinction between monetary investment and emotional investment. And I've told people there's a difference between monetary economics and emotional economics. How well, and I'm riffing off of the cafe we had of the history of the word economics, of using our household, our resources. How much emotional energy do I have to give to you? Do I want to give you any emotional energy of my resources? And hopefully I can practice doing that with as much loving kindness and attention, so that I'm not just so that I'm giving attention of how I'm using my emotional energy as an investment with others. And that comes into play sometimes even at the counter when I'm interacting with a clerk or something, and sometimes my energy field picks up a certain attitude. Well, do I want to say something, or should I shut up and just get my stuff and move on? So I guess I just I have a tendency to inhabit metaphors with all my senses, I guess.
Well, I know we're getting close to wrapping up, but I'm just thinking about a post-money world, what happens after neoliberalism, what happens, as we're making this transition, moving from post-industrial to the gig economy, to what happens after that as AI and the robotics take over and eliminate more and more jobs. And what are we going to do with the surplus? I think if everyone had a guaranteed income and were freed up from the tyranny of constant innovation, technologically driven, and that may be obsolete because, if the computers can do it, drive the cars and drive the buses and, fly the planes, all that energy, human energy, can be redirected. But what's it going to be? What are we going to redirect our attention to in this new world if it isn't about making money and monetizing our relationships to others and to nature? What will we be doing instead? And I believe that no one's going to figure this out for us. We're going to have to use our imaginations. And I do believe if you imagine a future that is compelling, your present is much more interesting. And I think that's where the dystopian, utopian kind of dilemma arises. And I've had to train myself in catastrophic situations where people were dropping dead left and right. And doctors were saying, you're doomed. I've heard a doctor say to a group of gay men who are sick that they should be willing to sacrifice their lives for science, that they were guinea pigs, and that was a worthwhile thing, according to this doctor, that they were guinea pigs. You know, so I had to live with lots of huge, incredibly toxic messages. And, you know, I always had to drop down into my pelvis. This isn't coming from my head. I dropped down into my pelvis, and I will beat the shit out of anyone who tries to define me in a way that I don't define myself. So it was a very much a warrior stance. And I protected it. And it wasn't just about me. I was protecting others as well. So I think that's a kind of Emersonian kind of thing too, is you're not in your head, not trying to be, you know, the head of the class, but you have to drop down into your pelvis and feel that power. And I think that's, then we can release ourselves ultimately, I think, in this, if we use our imaginations to create something compelling that we want to move towards, rather than just spend our times in states of fear and what we want to move away from and end up being very much supporting a status quo. We can release ourselves from that drama triangle of the persecutor, the victim, and the rescuer. And we can still, once we are released from that triangle, that dynamic, and we all play all three roles, when we can continue, we can help people because we want to, rather than because we're compelled to, because we're sucked into this triangle as a victim or a rescuer or a persecutor. And but I also believe that it's probably going to be inevitable while we're in this transition that we're going to get sucked into the drama triangle. And I think we've demonstrated it here in our cafes. But when we do get sucked into the drama triangle, let's turn this drama into some kind of gift.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And we can make better sense of our circumstances together if we're just alerted to, oh, okay, we got trapped in it again. And that's okay, we can disentangle from it.
To use a cliche, I mean, from the 60s, from, you know, grist for the mill. You know, I think that's been very much my way of facing into my own experience in my life at the last 20 years, is stop running away, and it's grist for the mill, and damn it to hell, have a sense of humor a little bit, you know, just a little bit. You know, you know, and sometimes humor has an edge to it, but, you know, I can tell the difference between humor with an edge and sarcasm. Robin Williams being one of my best funny men of all time, because he was just so honest about what was happening in the moment.
I think there's a lot of humor in this essay, actually. And you know, you may miss it if you're not following the language and the particular turns of phrase and the allusions. And stuff. But we're getting to the end. I want to offer one last little quote from Emerson.
Cool.
And that'll be the last I say. Conversation is a game of circles. In conversation, we pluck up the termini which bound the common of silence on every side. The parties are not to be judged by the spirit they partake and even express under this Pentecost. Tomorrow they will have receded from this high water mark. Tomorrow you shall find them stooping under old pack saddles. Yet let us enjoy the cloven flame whilst it glows on our walls. And then he goes on.
That is great.
Isn't that awesome?
That's great. And I like, I just want to say, Marco, I love your voice, how you give voice to those words. I just want to commend you of your voice. Comes through.
Thank you. I'm working on it.
Oh, also, I remember the title. It's Notes of a Native Son, the James Baldwin essay. I hope we maybe focus our attention on that someday, because I think along with Emerson, it's one of the most beautifully
James Baldwin is a great person to read.
Well, it's on this. This is Richard Wright, but is it his take on this book?
It's called Notes of a Native Son. It's a essay, and he may be riffing off of Richard Wright.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think they knew each other. And he comes out of that Harlem Renaissance. But I think with Black Lives Matter, it resonates, I think, with Fred Moten's work. And I think that's some of the best work around right now.
I like Albert Murray.
Yeah, we've focused on Albert Murray. Yeah. So anyway, that's just a suggestion for maybe some future cafe. We could look at that essay by James Baldwin and reflect on that with current events that are happening right now.
Yeah, we don't have anything on tap for next week just yet. We have, of course, the 2 or 3 proposals looming in the background. I think Sloterdijk's deep observation is kind of out of this realm of thought that we're in right now. Perhaps not. It might take us even further and then ground us in something. Personally, I'm interested in this gift economy thought. Charles Eisenstein, in one of his recent works, talks about erasing all debt. Maybe he's talked about that from the beginning of his writing, but that's not necessarily a new concept to me, but the way he stated it just opened up a new idea of how society could work. It doesn't sound too realistic to one side of me, but another side likes that. But that's just one small, but grand aspect of, and just one small facet of what can be accomplished through this. Johnny mentions the post-scarcity world, the hints of basic UBI, which I'm sure everybody's heard of or has mixed feelings. But yeah, I'd like to leave it open at this time. Maybe we can go back to the Thursday, Friday posting. I'll if we haven't decided something by then, maybe I'll find something related to the gift economy. But if we feel obliged to go in the direction of Baldwin, or even tie in an essay with current events or something, I don't know.
I think the gift economy, Eisenstein, I think that's been around for a while. I think Dave Loeffler, he's talking about a technological civilization that's happening now. He said it's actually started in 2010. We're just at the beginning of it. There's no guarantee that it'll happen because of the neoliberal domination right now. But he's saying that all these forces that have converged to create a huge advance, and it's like this, right? The bifurcation point, it can go really up or it can go really down and into collapse. And I think we're right at the cusp of that. So I think his stuff is much more interesting to me than Eisenstein stuff. Because I think that there's, he believes that there is a direction, a logical kind of development that has occurred since we were, that's gone through many kinds of transformation, but it has a direction to it. It's not just ad-libbing or flying by the seat of our pants. Anyway, he I think is much more interesting to me than Eisenstein. And because he's the one who's talking about a post-money economy, and this is concrete. It's not something airy-fairy, or we should just right. Our wish list,
I was working on a summary of the last section of I always forget the name, distributing potentialities, which tied in with a lot of I think Marco was exploring, and we were kind of loosely threading together in December. So perhaps I'll post a summary of my thoughts in the next day or two. But yeah, I think that'd be a good way to go. That'd be a good
Yeah, I think
eye
Connolly.
opener there.
Yeah, I think Connolly too, drawing on that, what he's trying to put down, what he's trying to map out. I think he's very much in an Emersonian kind of tradition. So that kind of idea of pluralism and preserving pluralism, it's a very postmodern notion. And anyway, I think those themes we've gone in and out of them, and I think those are worth exploring further. So we'll all think about that together.
Okay, it was good to see you all.
Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you.
A great Emerson conversation.
Likewise, thanks.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.